The convoy was burning. Sergeant First Class Derek Holbrook screamed into his radio for fire support that would not come while rounds snapped through the air like angry hornets seeking flesh. 12 Marines pinned behind 2 disabled Humvees in the middle of Ramadi. Insurgents closing from 3 directions, and their designated marksman was lying in the dirt with a bullet through his shoulder. Gunnery Sergeant Holbrook grabbed the fallen Marine's M110 sniper rifle and held it up, blood still wet on the stock. "Any of you know how to use this thing?" he shouted over the gunfire. Silence answered him. Then the quiet supply clerk nobody ever noticed stood up from behind the rear vehicle and reached for the weapon. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Perhaps you know someone whose hidden abilities changed everything when it mattered most. Private First Class Yuna Kwan had been invisible for 11 months. She was the small Korean-American woman who processed ammunition requests and drove supply trucks and never spoke unless duty required it. The combat Marines called her Ghost when they bothered to call her anything at all, though most of the time they looked right through her like she was part of the vehicle. She had learned to prefer it that way. 6 hours earlier, before the sun had fully risen over Camp Ramadi, Yuna had been loading the convoy vehicles when she noticed the dog. It was a skinny thing with matted fur and ribs showing through its sides, watching her from behind a concrete barrier with eyes that expected nothing good from humans. She had pulled the energy bar from her cargo pocket, the only food she had brought for the 12-hour mission, and broken it into pieces. The dog had approached slowly, ready to bolt, and she had waited without moving until it finally took the food from her palm. Corporal Travis Rinko had walked past at that moment and laughed. "Wasting food on a mutt," he said. "Figures the supply girl would rather feed strays than do her job." Yuna had said nothing. She had simply watched the dog eat and then returned to loading ammunition crates, while Rinko's laughter faded into the morning. Now, that same ammunition was scattered across the road, and Rinko was pressed against a tire while screaming for someone to do something while rounds punched through the metal above his head. Lance Corporal Webb, their marksman, was being dragged to cover by 2 Marines while blood poured from his shoulder. The M110 rifle lay in the dust where it had fallen, and Gunnery Sergeant Holbrook was looking at each of his Marines in turn, searching for someone who could use it. "Any sharpshooters?" he called again. "Anyone with rifle quals above marksman. I need accurate fire on that rooftop now, or we are all dead in 3 minutes." Yuna moved before she could stop herself. 11 months of being invisible, 11 months of swallowing her pride and doing her job and pretending she was exactly what they thought she was, and now her body was moving toward that rifle like it remembered something her mind had tried to forget. Her father's voice echoed somewhere deep. "Breathing is everything, little one. Control the breath and you control the bullet." She reached for the weapon. Rinko's hand clamped on her wrist. "What do you think you're doing?" he spat. "This is not a supply run. This is combat. Get back behind cover and stay out of the way." The gunfire was constant now, a wall of sound that made thinking difficult. Somewhere to the east, the heavy thump of a machine gun had joined the chorus. They had maybe 2 minutes before the insurgents coordinated their assault and overran their position. Yuna looked at Rinko's hand on her wrist, then up at his face. "Let go," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. Rinko's expression twisted with contempt. "You think because you can drive a truck you can shoot a precision rifle? Stay in your lane, private. Leave the fighting to Marines who actually know what they are doing." Holbrook appeared beside them. He looked at Yuna, looked at the rifle, looked at the rooftops where muzzle flashes were multiplying. "What is your qualification, private?" Yuna met his eyes. She had never told anyone. 11 months of silence, of being underestimated, of watching men like Rinko dismiss her without a second thought. But Marines were dying, and the rifle was right there, and she could hear her father's voice telling her that skill without purpose was meaningless. "I can shoot, Gunnery Sergeant." "That is not what I asked." Another burst of fire raked their position. A Marine screamed somewhere behind them. Yuna pulled her wrist free from Rinko's grip and picked up the rifle. The weight was familiar in her hands, balanced and precise, and for a moment she was 12 years old again on her father's range in Pohang, learning to read wind and distance and the space between heartbeats. Holbrook stared at her, for a long moment. Then he pointed toward a low wall 20 meters ahead. Get to that position. You have 30 seconds to prove you can shoot, or I am pulling you back myself. Yuna moved. Behind her, she heard Rinko's voice sharp with disbelief. Gunny, you cannot be serious. She is supply. She's going to get herself killed. Then stay behind her and make sure she does not, Holbrook replied. Consider it your new assignment, Corporal. Yuna reached the wall, pressed her back against the concrete, and chamber around. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady, ever since her father had first placed a rifle in her grip and told her that the weapon was only as good as the calm behind it. She had not touched a precision rifle in 3 years, not since the fight that had driven her across the ocean and into a uniform her father had never wanted her to wear. She rose above the wall, found the sight picture, and began to search for targets. And every Marine in that burning convoy watched the quiet girl they had never noticed take aim at an enemy who had no idea what was coming. Yuna finger found the trigger, and for the first time since the convoy left Camp Ramadi, every single Marine was looking at her. The first target appeared in a third-floor window, 400 meters east. Yuna saw him before he saw her, a silhouette against the darker room behind him, rifle barrel glinting in the morning sun as he searched for Marines to kill. She exhaled slowly, felt her heartbeat in her trigger finger, and waited for the space between beats, just as her father had taught her 20,000 times before. Rinko slammed into her from the side. The rifle jerked as she fell, the shot going wide, and the insurgent in the window ducked back into shadow. Rinko was on top of her, grabbing for the weapon, his face twisted with something between rage and fear. "Give me the rifle," he shouted. "You're going to get us all killed playing soldier." Yuna held on. The M110 was pressed between them, Rinko's weight pinning her to the ground, and all around them the firefight continued without pause. She could feel the vibration of rounds impacting nearby, could hear Holbrook screaming orders, could smell the burning fuel from the disabled Humvees mixing with cordite and dust. "I had the shot," she said through gritted teeth. "You made me miss. You do not get shots." Rinko wrenched at the rifle. "You get supply manifests and convoy schedules. You're not a shooter. You're not infantry. You're nothing." The words hit harder than she expected. 11 months of being nothing, of choosing to be invisible because it was easier than explaining who she really was. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, disappointed and proud in equal measure. "You have a gift, Yuna. Why do you hide it?" "Corporal Rinko." Holbrook's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Get off my shooter. Now." Rinko froze. "Gunny, she is supply personnel. She has no business with a precision weapon in a combat situation. Regulations clearly state that. Regulations state that I am in command of this convoy, and we are about to be overrun." Holbrook grabbed Rinko by his body armor and hauled him off Yuna. "She says she can shoot. Right now, that is more than anyone else is offering." He looked down at Yuna, still on the ground with the rifle clutched to her chest. "Get up, Private. Prove him wrong or prove him right, but do it fast." Yuna rose. Her hands found their grip on the rifle again, muscle memory that 3 years of absence had not erased. She scanned the windows where the insurgent had disappeared, but he was gone, warned by her missed shot. Around her, the surviving Marines were returning fire from behind the disabled vehicles, but their position was untenable. Too exposed, too little cover, too many angles for the enemy to exploit. "We need to move," Holbrook said, reading her thoughts. "There is a school building 50 meters north. Concrete walls, multiple floors, defensible position." He turned to his Marines. "Suppressing fire on my command. We move in 2 teams. Rinko, you take rear security. Private Quan moves with me." Rinko's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The other Marines glanced at Yuna with expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity. She ignored them all, focusing on the rooftops, the windows, the shadows where death might be waiting. The memory came unbidden, bright and warm despite the horror surrounding her. She was 10 years old, lying prone on a mat at her father's private range outside Pohang. Master Sergeant Park Kwan, 23 years in the Republic of Korea Army Special Warfare Command, knelt beside her with patience that seemed infinite. The rifle was too big for her small frame, but he had modified the stock himself, carved it down so she could reach the trigger without straining. "Breathe, little one," he said in Korean. "The bullet goes where your breath tells it to go. Fast breath, wild bullet. Slow breath, true bullet. Which do you choose?" "Slow breath," she had answered, and he had smiled that rare smile that made all the hours of practice worth enduring. "True bullet," he confirmed. "Now show me." She had shown him, shot after shot, year after year, until she could put rounds through a target at 800 meters while her classmates were still learning basic mathematics. Her father had never pushed her toward military service. Not directly, but the expectation had always been there, unspoken and heavy. The Kwan family had produced soldiers for 4 generations. Her grandfather had fought at Heartbreak Ridge. Her father had conducted operations in places that did not officially exist. The rifle was her inheritance, her birthright, her cage. Suppressing fire, Holbrook roared, and the memory shattered. Yuna ran. The 50 meters to the school building felt like 50 miles, rounds kicking up dust around her feet, the rifle heavy in her arms. She heard Marines shouting, heard the deeper bark of the enemy machine gun starting up again, heard someone cry out in pain behind her. But she kept running, kept breathing, kept her eyes on the doorway ahead. She made it through the entrance and pressed herself against an interior wall, chest heaving. Holbrook came through seconds later, then more Marines dragging their wounded. Rinko was last, walking backward, firing controlled bursts at targets she could not see. The school was old, abandoned, stripped of anything valuable long ago. Concrete walls pocked with bullet holes from previous battles. Empty window frames looking out on streets that had become killing grounds. Stairs leading up to second and third floors that would give her the elevation she needed. Yuna was already moving toward the stairs when Rinko's voice stopped her. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. "High ground." She did not turn around. "I need elevation and clear sight lines. You need to stay with the group and stop pretending you are something you are not." Now she turned. Rinko stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright street outside, and for a moment she saw something beneath his contempt. Fear, not of the enemy, but of her, of what it would mean if the quiet supply girl could do what trained infantry could not. "Corporal," she said quietly, "there are at least 15 insurgents in those buildings. They have a machine gun, probably more than one, and they're going to assault this position within the next 10 minutes. I can help stop that, but only if you let me do what I know how to do." Rinko took a step toward her. "And what exactly is that, Private? What do you know how to do that makes you think you can pick up a sniper rifle and save the day?" Before she could answer, Holbrook appeared between them. "Enough." He looked at Yuna with eyes that had seen too many Marines die in places like this. "Second floor, east-facing windows. You have your position." He turned to Rinko. "And you have your orders. Rear security means watching our backs, not harassing my shooter. Move." Yuna climbed the stairs without looking back. She found a classroom with windows facing the enemy positions, kicked debris away from the corner, and settled into a prone position with the rifle extended before her. The sight picture was good. 400 meters to the nearest occupied building, 600 to the rooftops where she had seen movement. She controlled her breathing, found her center, and began to hunt. Below her, she could hear Rinko arguing with Holbrook in harsh whispers. She heard her own name, heard the word supply spoken like a curse, heard Holbrook's response too quiet to make out. But none of it mattered now. The rifle was in her hands, and the enemy was in her sights, and somewhere in her chest. A door that had been closed for 3 years was beginning to open. Her father had been right about one thing. The gift did not disappear just because he tried to hide it. It waited, patient and hungry, for the moment when hiding was no longer an option. Yuna found her first target, exhaled slowly, and felt her fingers settle against the trigger with the familiarity of coming home. And downstairs, boots were already pounding up the stairwell as Rinko came to pull her off the line. Rinko was 3 steps into the classroom when Yuna fired. The shot was clean. 412 meters, slight crosswind from the southeast, target moving left to right across a third-floor balcony with an RPG launcher balanced on a shoulder. She had calculated the lead in the space between heartbeats. Adjusted for the wind, she could see rippling a torn awning 2 buildings down, and squeezed the trigger at the exact moment her lungs emptied. The insurgent dropped. The RPG clattered unfired onto the balcony floor. Rinko stopped moving. Behind him, she heard someone inhale sharply. Yuna worked the bolt, chambered a fresh round, and returned her eye to the scope. Movement in the building to the left. Second floor, 4th window from the corner. A rifle barrel sliding forward through the shadows. She fired again. The barrel jerked and disappeared. Through the scope, she saw a brief spray of red against the interior wall. "What the hell?" someone whispered behind her. Yuna ignored the voice. Another target. Rooftop, 600 meters. A man crouched behind a water tank with only his head and shoulders visible. A difficult shot. The heat shimmer rising from the street created a wavering distortion that made distance estimation unreliable. Her father would have called it a teaching moment. She called it Tuesday. The third shot took the man just below the left eye. The room had gone completely silent except for the distant crackle of gunfire from the Marines downstairs. Yuna could feel them staring at her, could feel the weight of their disbelief pressing against her back like a physical force. She did not turn around. There were still enemies in those buildings, still threats to identify and eliminate, and every second she spent acknowledging their shock was a second she was not doing her job. Lucky shots. Rinko's voice was flat, but she could hear the uncertainty beneath it. 3 lucky shots. Anyone can get lucky. Private First Class Jerome Hastings, 19 years old and on his first deployment, stepped past Rinko into the classroom. He was staring at Yuna like she had grown his second head. "Corporal," he said slowly, "I have been shooting rifles since I was 6 years old. My daddy took me deer hunting every season until I enlisted. I have never seen anyone shoot like that." He paused. "That is not luck." Rinko opened his mouth to respond, but Yuna cut him off without turning around. Movement on the roof of the building with the blue door. 2 tangos. One is setting up a PKM. She heard Rinko take a step closer, heard him curse under his breath. "I do not see anything. Left side of the roof. Behind the satellite dish. They're using a tarp for concealment, but the wind is lifting the corner." There was a long pause. Then Rinko's voice, grudging and quiet. "I see them." The machine gun team was working fast, feeding the belt into the PKM with practiced efficiency. In 30 seconds, they would be operational. In 45 seconds, they would be pouring rounds into the school building from an elevated position the Marines below could not effectively engage. Yuna did the math. 620 meters. Crosswind had shifted, now coming from the east. The tarp was obscuring her sight line, giving her only intermittent glimpses of the targets as the wind moved the fabric. She would have 1 chance, maybe 2, before they completed setup and started firing. She waited, breathing slow, heartbeat steady. The tarp lifted. The first insurgent fell before he could finish loading the belt. The second tried to grab the weapon and continue the work, and Yuna put a round through his chest before his hands reached the receiver. Hastings made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a prayer. "Holy Mother of God." He turned to Rinko. "Corporal, are you seeing this?" Rinko said nothing. His face had gone pale beneath the dust and sweat, and he was staring at Yuna like he was seeing her for the first time. Like the quiet supply girl he had dismissed and mocked and shoved to the ground had suddenly transformed into something he did not have a category for. Yuna finally turned from the window. She met Rinko's eyes and saw the war happening behind them, the struggle between what he had believed and what he had just witnessed. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. "Almost. I am not lucky," she said quietly. "I am trained, and right now I am the best chance these Marines have of surviving the next hour. So you can either help me or you can get out of my way. But what you cannot do is keep pretending I am something I am not." The distant thump of heavy weapons echoed from the east. More insurgent reinforcements arriving, drawn by the sound of battle. Yuna turned back to the window and saw movement in at least 4 new positions, fresh fighters spreading out through the buildings, setting up firing points, coordinating what looked like a methodical assault on the school. "Gunny," Rinko called down the stairs, his voice strained. "We have a problem. They're bringing up more fighters. A lot more fighters." Holbrook's boots pounded up the stairs. He entered the classroom and moved to the window beside Yuna, scanning the enemy positions with experienced eyes. His jaw tightened as he counted the new threats. At least 20 additional combatants were filtering into the buildings across the street, and she could see more arriving from the north. "Can you keep them suppressed?" he asked without looking at her. Yuna checked her ammunition. She had started with 40 rounds. She was down to 31. The math was not complicated, and it was not good. "I can slow them down," she said, "but I cannot stop them. Not with what I have." Holbrook nodded slowly. "Then we make every round count." He turned to Rinko and Hastings. "Get the rest of the squad up here. We are making this our strong point." He looked at Yuna one more time, and this time there was something like respect in his expression. "Whatever you did before you joined my convoy, Private, I am glad you are here now." She did not respond. There was no time. The enemy was adapting, spreading out, using cover more effectively now that they knew a skilled shooter was targeting them. She could see them communicating with hand signals, coordinating their movements, probing for weaknesses. They had figured out they had a sniper problem. Now, they were going to solve it. Yuna settled back into position, controlled her breathing, and prepared to show them just how difficult that solution was going to be. But even as she found her next target, even as she felt the familiar calm descend over her mind, she could hear the rumble of vehicles approaching from the east. The enemy was not just reinforcing. They were escalating, and a heavy machine gun that opened fire from 3 blocks away sent rounds punching through the concrete walls around her like the building itself was made of paper. The machine gun was tearing the building apart. Yuna pressed herself flat against the floor as rounds punched through the wall above her head, showering her with concrete dust and fragments. The PCAM had been bad enough, but this was something heavier, something mounted on a vehicle judging by the sustained rate of fire. Every burst sent shockwaves through the old school, and she could hear Marines shouting downstairs as they scrambled for cover that barely existed. Hastings had thrown himself behind an overturned desk, his eyes wide and white in his dust-covered face. Rinko was on the floor near the doorway, cursing steadily under his breath. Through the chaos, Yuna heard Holbrook calling for a status report, heard someone respond that Corporal Stillman was hit, heard the words "bleeding bad" filter up through the gunfire. She had to find that machine gun. Yuna crawled toward the window, staying below the line of fire, glass and debris cutting into her palms and knees. The shooter was disciplined, walking his rounds across the building in methodical patterns, never staying on one position long enough for return fire. Whoever was behind that weapon knew exactly what they were doing. She reached the window frame and raised her head just enough to scan the street. The muzzle flash was coming from a rooftop 800 meters east, partially concealed behind a concrete water tower. The angle was terrible. She could see maybe 6 inches of the gun's barrel and nothing of the shooter himself. The rest was blocked by the water tower's bulk. "Impossible shot," Rinko said from behind her. He had crawled closer, his earlier hostility temporarily suspended by the reality of their situation. "You cannot hit what you cannot see." Yuna did not answer. She was calculating angles, studying the water tower, looking for any gap in the concealment. There, a narrow space between the tower's base and the rooftop wall, maybe 8 inches wide. If the gunner shifted position to traverse fire to the north side of the school, he might expose himself in that gap for a fraction of a second. She needed him to move. "Hastings," she called without taking her eyes from the scope. "I need you to draw fire to the north windows. Make noise, show movement, but stay behind cover." Hastings looked at her like she had lost her mind. "You want me to make myself a target? I want you to make him think there is a target. There is a difference. Just do it. Now." The young Marine hesitated, then nodded and began crawling toward the north side of the classroom. Yuna tracked the machine gun position, watching for any change in the shooter's stance. The rounds kept coming, chewing through the south wall, but she could see the barrel beginning to shift as the gunner searched for new targets. Hastings reached the north window and grabbed a broken piece of furniture. He shoved it into the window frame, letting it catch the light, and immediately pulled back behind the wall. The machine gun swung north. For one heartbeat, maybe less, the gunner's shoulder appeared in the gap between the water tower and the rooftop wall. 1 square foot of exposed flesh at 800 meters through a 6-inch gap. Yuna fired. The machine gun went silent. 800 meters away, on a rooftop that had seemed untouchable, a man named Tariq al-Rashidi stared in disbelief at the body of his best gunner. The American sniper had made an impossible shot through a gap that should not have existed. Tariq had been fighting these battles for 3 years, had faced Marines and soldiers and contractors from a dozen nations, and he had never encountered anything like this. Find that shooter, he ordered the men around him. Find that shooter and kill them, or we will lose this entire block. His fighters spread out, moving more cautiously now, but Tariq could see the fear in their eyes. They had come to overwhelm a damaged convoy, to kill Marines caught in the open, and instead, they had found something unexpected, something that was turning their carefully planned ambush into a disaster. Back in the school, Yuna was already searching for new targets. Her hands were steady, but her ammunition count was dropping faster than she liked. 23 rounds remaining. At least 30 confirmed enemy fighters in the surrounding buildings. The math was getting worse. Holbrook appeared in the doorway, his face grim. That was good shooting, Private. Corporal Rinko tells me you have been performing well under his supervision. Yuna's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Rinko had crawled back toward the gunny the moment the machine gun stopped, no doubt repositioning himself to claim credit for managing the supply girl who was somehow saving their lives. She had seen his type before. Men who took credit for victories and assigned blame for defeats, always positioning themselves on the right side of the story. It did not matter. The only thing that mattered was keeping these Marines alive. Gunny, she said, we have a problem. There is an RPG team moving through the alley to the southwest. 3 men. They will have a clear shot at this building in about 90 seconds. Holbrook moved to her position and followed her sightline. She pointed out the alley, the 3 figures darting between cover, the launcher clearly visible on the lead man's shoulder. At their current pace, they would reach a firing position behind a burned-out car in less than 2 minutes. From there, they could put rockets through every window on the south side of the school. Can you take them? Holbrook asked. The alley was narrow and deep in shadow. The targets were moving fast, only visible for brief moments as they crossed gaps between cover. It was the kind of shot her father would have used as a final exam, the kind of shot that separated competent marksmen from true snipers. 1 of them, she said. Maybe 2 if I am fast. The 3rd will reach cover before I can reload. Then we need another solution. Holbrook turned to Rinko. Take Hastings and 2 others. Circle around through the back entrance and intercept that RPG team before they get into position. Rinko's face went pale. Gunny, that is open ground. We will be exposed for at least 50 meters, which is why Private Kwan is going to cover your movement. He looked at Yuna. Can you keep their heads down long enough for a 4-man team to cross that ground? She checked her ammunition again. 23 rounds. For Marines crossing open ground against an unknown number of enemies. Every shot would have to count. Every bullet would have to buy seconds of safety. Yes, Gunnery Sergeant. She met Rinko's eyes. I will keep you alive, Corporal, whether you believe I can or not. Rinko held her gaze for a long moment. Whatever war was happening behind his eyes, he swallowed it and nodded. Then do not miss, Private. He gathered his team and headed for the stairs. Yuna returned to her scope, tracking the RPG team's progress through the alley, calculating angles and distances in a shrinking window of time before everything went wrong. The 3 insurgents were close now, 80 meters from their firing position. 70. The lead man was already slowing, preparing to set up behind the burned-out car. Yuna put her crosshairs on his chest and began to squeeze the trigger. But in her peripheral vision, she saw movement on a rooftop to the north. Another RPG team, a 2nd launcher, and this one was already aimed directly at the room where she was lying. Yuna made a choice in the space between heartbeats. The RPG team on the northern rooftop was already sighting in on her window. The team in the southwest alley was seconds from reaching their firing position. She could not engage both. She could not save herself and cover Rinko's movement at the same time. She chose the Marines. Her first shot took the lead insurgent in the alley through the top of his skull, just as he knelt behind the burnout car. The second man grabbed for the fallen RPG launcher, and she put a round through his shoulder before he could lift it. He screamed and dropped, clutching the wound, and the third man dove behind a concrete barrier and disappeared from her sight line. Then she rolled. The rocket hit the window frame where she had been lying half a second earlier. The explosion filled the classroom with fire and debris, throwing her against the far wall, driving the air from her lungs. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Dust and smoke choked her vision. She could not hear, could not see, could barely breathe. But she could still move. Yuna crawled through the rubble, searching for the rifle. Her hands found it beneath a collapsed section of ceiling, scratched and covered in dust, but intact. She dragged it to her chest and forced herself upright, using the wall for support. The classroom was destroyed. The window was gone, replaced by a jagged hole in the concrete. Hastings was on the ground near the doorway, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, but conscious, already trying to stand. The northern rooftop. She had to neutralize that RPG team before they could reload. Yuna stumbled to what remained of the window and raised the rifle. Her vision was blurred, her hands shaking for the first time since the battle began. She found the rooftop, found the two men scrambling to load another rocket into the launcher. 600 meters. Wind from the east. Her father's voice cut through the ringing in her ears, steady and calm as it had always been. One shot, one purpose, little one. Your purpose is not the bullet. Your purpose is what the bullet protects. She fired twice. Both men fell. Then her legs gave out, and she slid down the wall to the floor, the rifle heavy across her lap. Hastings was beside her now, his young face pale beneath the blood and dust. You okay, Private? You okay? She nodded, though she was not sure it was true. Her body felt disconnected, her thoughts scattered. She had been close to death before, in training exercises that her father had designed to push her limits, but this was different. This was real. The men she had killed were real. The rocket that had nearly ended her was real. Holbrook's voice reached her from somewhere below, distorted by the damage to her hearing. Status report. I need a status report now. Yuna forced herself to focus. She checked her ammunition. 14 rounds remaining. She had started with 40. In less than an hour of combat, she had burned through more than half her supply, and the enemy was still out there, still probing, still looking for weakness. Gunny, she called down, her voice hoarse. Northern RPG team neutralized. Southwest team down 2. One still active behind cover. I am down to 14 rounds. The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know about how bad that news was. Holbrook appeared in the doorway, his face grim. He surveyed the destroyed classroom. The hole in the wall, Hastings bleeding on the floor, Yuna slumped against the rubble with her rifle. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes that might have been despair, quickly suppressed. QRF is delayed, he said quietly. Ambush on their route. They're fighting through, but it's going to be at least 2 hours before they reach us. 2 hours. Yuna did the math automatically, the way her father had trained her to calculate odds and resources and probability of survival. 14 rounds. At least 20 enemy fighters still active. 2 hours of sustained combat. We're not going to make it, Hastings said, voicing what everyone was thinking. We're going to make it, Holbrook replied, but his voice lacked conviction. We consolidate on the first floor, reduce our exposure, make them come to us. Every minute we hold is a minute closer to extraction. From somewhere outside, gunfire erupted again. Rinko's team engaging the remaining insurgent from the alley, or maybe new contacts entirely. The battle was not pausing to let them recover. The battle did not care about ammunition counts or delayed reinforcements or the growing list of wounded Marines. Yuna pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled but held. She looked at Holbrook and saw a man who had run out of options, who was watching his Marines die in a place that would become a footnote in a war that most Americans had already forgotten. "I need to move to a different position," she said. "They have my location now. If I stay here, they will just keep sending rockets until one of them finishes the job." Holbrook nodded slowly. "Third floor. North side. It will give you angles on their approach routes and keep you away from where they expect you to be." She started toward the stairs, then stopped. The memory had been hovering at the edge of her consciousness since the rocket hit, and now it pushed forward, demanding attention. She was 19 years old, standing in her father's study in Pohang, the acceptance letter from the United States Marine Corps clutched in her hand. Her father sat behind his desk, his face carved from stone, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before. Betrayal. "You could have been the finest sniper in the Republic of Korea," he said in Korean. "You could have honored 4 generations of warriors. Instead, you run away to become a truck driver for the Americans." "I am not running away," she had replied. "I am finding my own path." "Your path." He had stood then, and for the first time in her life, she had seen her father lose control. His hands swept across the desk, sending papers and photographs scattering. "Your path is a fantasy. You have a gift that comes once in a generation, and you're throwing it away because you are too proud to follow in your family's footsteps." She had left that night. She had not spoken to him since. Now, climbing the stairs of a shattered school in the middle of Ramadi with 14 rounds and 2 hours to survive, she understood something she had been too young and too angry to understand then. Her father had not been trying to control her. He had been trying to prepare her for moments exactly like this one. Yuna reached the 3rd floor and found a position overlooking the northern approach. She settled into her stance, controlled her breathing, and waited for the next wave. Below, she heard Holbrook's voice on the radio, reporting their ammunition status to command. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. At current rate of fire, they had 43 minutes before they would be throwing rocks. Lance Corporal Amy Chun found her 20 minutes later. Yuna had taken 4 more shots in that time, each one precise, each one buying seconds of safety for the Marines below. Her ammunition count was down to 10 rounds. The enemy had learned to fear her new position, staying deeper in cover, moving faster between exposure points. But they had not stopped coming. Chun crawled across the debris-strewn floor and settled beside her, a canteen in one hand and a handful of rifle magazines in the other. "These are all we could spare," she said quietly. 30 rounds. It is not much, but it is something." Yuna took the magazines without looking away from her scope. Her throat was raw from dust and smoke, and she drank from the canteen in small, controlled sips. "Thank you." She did not leave. She stayed there, pressed against the wall beside Yuna's position, watching the smaller woman work with an expression that mixed awe and curiosity. Finally, she spoke again. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air between them. Yuna had heard variations of it a dozen times in the last hour, shouted by Marines who could not reconcile the quiet supply clerk with the shooter who was keeping them alive. But Chun asked it differently, not as an accusation or an expression of disbelief, but as a genuine question from someone who wanted to understand. Yuna was silent for a long moment. Another insurgent moved between buildings, and she tracked him with her scope, waiting for a clear shot that never came. He disappeared into shadow, and she let out a slow breath. "My father is Master Sergeant Parkwan," she said finally. "Retired now, but for 23 years he served in the Republic of Korea Army Special Warfare Command. He was their chief sniper instructor for the last decade of his service. The most decorated marksman in the history of the ROK Special Operations community." Chun stared at her. "Your father taught Korean Special Forces how to shoot?" "He taught them everything." Yuna's voice was flat, controlled, but something old and painful moved beneath the surface. Fieldcraft, stalking, ballistics, wind reading, psychological preparation. He wrote the manual they still use today. She paused. "And he taught me." "Since when?" "Since I was 8 years old." Yuna remembered the first time her father had placed a rifle in her hands, a small .22 caliber training weapon he had modified for her grip. She remembered the patience in his voice, the pride in his eyes when she hit her first target. "By the time I was 16, I could outshoot most of his students. By 18, I was better than anyone in his program, except him. Chin shook her head slowly. Then what the hell are you doing driving supply trucks in Ramadi? The question cut deeper than Sean could have known. Yuna saw another flicker of movement through her scope and fired, dropping an insurgent who had been setting up a firing position on a distant balcony. 9 rounds remaining. The mechanical process of a shot gave her time to find words. My father wanted me to join the ROK army, she said. Follow in his footsteps, become a sniper for special operations, continue the family tradition. 4 generations of Kwans have served. My grandfather fought at Heartbreak Ridge. My great-grandfather was a resistance fighter during the occupation. The rifle is our inheritance. But you did not want that, Chin said. I wanted to be more than my father's daughter. Yuna heard the bitterness in her own voice and forced it down. I wanted to find out who I was without his shadow over everything I did. So I left, came to America, joined the Marines as the thing furthest from what he trained me to be. A supply clerk. A supply clerk. Yuna almost smiled. He did not speak to me for 3 years after I left. I do not even know if he knows I am deployed. She shook her head. I spent 11 months pretending I was exactly what everyone thought I was. Invisible. Unremarkable. Just another support puke taking up space. Until today. Until today. The sound of gunfire below intensified briefly, then faded. Holbrook's voice crackled over the radio, reporting 2 more wounded, ammunition critical across all positions. The noose was tightening. The enemy knew they were bleeding, knew they were running out of time and bullets and options. Why tell me? Chin asked. Why now? Yuna did not answer immediately. She was scanning the rooftops, searching for the man she had seen earlier, the one who moved like a commander, who directed the others with hand signals and seemed to be orchestrating the entire assault. If she could find him, if she could take him out, the enemy coordination might collapse. It might buy them the time they needed. There, 850 meters southeast, a figure on a rooftop, standing exposed for just a moment as he surveyed the battlefield. Even at this distance, she could see the confidence in his posture, the authority in the way the men around him responded to his gestures. This was the leader. This was the man who had planned the ambush, who had directed the reinforcements, who was methodically trying to kill every Marine in this building. But the shot was impossible. The distance was at the extreme edge of the M110's effective range. The wind had shifted again, swirling between the buildings in unpredictable patterns. Heat shimmer rose from every rooftop, distorting the air, making precise calculation a matter of instinct as much as mathematics. Her father had taught her to make impossible shots. He had spent 15 years preparing her for moments exactly like this one, when the mathematics said no and the situation demanded yes. She had rejected his path, rejected his plans for her, rejected everything he represented. And now, in the most desperate moment of her life, she was reaching for everything he had given her. The commander turned to speak to one of his men, and for 3 seconds his chest was fully exposed. Yuna exhaled, found the space between heartbeats, felt her father's voice in her mind, calm and steady, guiding her as he had guided her since she was a child. One shot, little one. One purpose. Your purpose is not the bullet. Your purpose is what the bullet protects. She fired. 850 meters away, the commander's body jerked once and fell. The men around him scattered in panic, suddenly leaderless, suddenly afraid. The coordinated assault that had been building began to fragment as fighters looked to each other for orders that were not coming. Yuna watched it happen through her scope. 8 rounds remaining. Maybe an hour until the enemy regrouped. Maybe less. But for the first time since the ambush began, the odds had shifted. Chin was staring at her with something like reverence. That was over 800 meters. In this wind, through the heat shimmer. How? Yuna lowered the rifle and met her eyes. My father taught me that the impossible is just the untrained word for the difficult. She looked back toward the enemy positions, toward the chaos she had created with a single bullet. I spent 3 years trying to forget everything he gave me. She paused. I think maybe it is time to stop forgetting. Her father's voice was in her head now, steady as it had been when she was 12 and learning to control her breathing. One shot, one purpose, he would say. Your purpose is not the bullet. Your purpose is what the bullet protects. For the first time in 3 years, Yuna did not try to silence that voice. She let it guide her, let it steady her, let it remind her of who she had been trained to become. The supply clerk was gone. The daughter of Master Sergeant Park, Quan, had taken her place, and she still had 8 rounds left to prove it. The Marines had begun to orbit around her like planets around a sun. Yuna noticed it in small ways at first. Hastings appeared with water and a protein bar he had scrounged from somewhere, pressing them into her hands with quiet insistence. Chun stayed at her side, scanning the buildings with binoculars and calling out movement before Yuna could spot it herself. 2 riflemen she did not know by name took up positions flanking her window, adding their fire to any target she engaged. They were protecting her now. The quiet supply girl who had been invisible for 11 months had become the most important person in the building. Hastings settled against the wall nearby, his forehead wound crudely bandaged with a torn piece of uniform. He watched her scan the rooftops with an expression that mixed exhaustion and wonder. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. I keep thinking about all those times I walked right past you in the chow hall. All those times I did not even notice you were there. Yuna did not respond. She was tracking movement 3 buildings east, 2 fighters trying to work their way closer through a series of connected rooftops. They were being careful, staying low, but she could see them through gaps in their cover. Hastings continued, you were right there the whole time. Best shooter I have ever seen, and you were filing supply requisitions and driving trucks. He shook his head. It is like finding out the quiet kid in the back of class is secretly a superhero or something. She fired twice. Both fighters dropped. 6 rounds remaining. Hastings let out a low whistle. See, that is exactly what I'm talking about. He paused, then added with a grin that looked strange on his blood-streaked face. If we survive this, I'm telling everyone back home that I fought alongside a Korean superhero sniper. Nobody is going to believe me, but I'm telling them anyway. Despite everything, Yuna felt the corner of her mouth twitch. You should probably focus on the surviving part first. Fair point. He raised his rifle and scanned his sector. But I'm still telling the story. Chun appeared in the doorway, her expression tense. Gunny wants a status update. Also, Webb is asking for you. Yuna frowned. Webb? The marksman. The one you took the rifle from. He is conscious, and he wants to talk to you. Chun shrugged. Holbrook said to make it quick, but he thought you should know. Yuna hesitated. Every second away from her position was a second the enemy could use to advance. But Webb had been the one carrying this rifle before her, the one who would have been making these shots if an insurgent bullet had not found his shoulder. She owed him something for that. Watch my sector, she told Chun. 2 minutes. She found Webb on the first floor, propped against a wall with his shoulder wrapped in bloody bandages. His face was pale and sheen with sweat, but his eyes were clear as they found her approaching. The rifle looked good in her hands, he said, better than it ever looked in mine. Yuna knelt beside him. You would have done the same thing. You would have kept them alive. Webb shook his head slowly. No, I would have tried. I would have done my best. But what you're doing up there, the shots you're making. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I have been a designated marksman for 2 years. I have never seen anyone shoot like that. Not in training, not in combat, not anywhere. She did not know what to say. The praise felt strange, uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that did not quite fit. I'm just doing what needs to be done. That is exactly what makes it impressive. Webb reached out with his good hand and gripped her forearm. When I got hit, when I went down, I thought we were all dead. I thought my rifle was going to lie in the dirt while my friends got overrun. He squeezed her arm. You picked it up. You saved us. Whatever happens now, you need to know that. You already saved us. Yuna felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had built long ago developing cracks. She had spent 3 years running from who she was, hiding from her father's legacy, pretending the gift she carried was a burden instead of a responsibility. And now this wounded Marine was looking at her, like she was the answer to a prayer he had not known how to speak. Thank you, she said quietly. It was not enough, but it was all she had. Webb released her arm and leaned back against the wall. Now get back up there and finish what you started. We are all counting on you. She returned to the third floor to find the situation deteriorating. Chun was at the window, calling out contacts. They are massing to the east. At least 15 fighters gathering behind that apartment complex. Looks like they are getting ready for a coordinated push. Yuna moved to her position and confirmed what Chun was seeing. The enemy had regrouped faster than expected, finding new leadership after their commander fell. They were organizing into assault teams, preparing to rush the school from multiple directions simultaneously. With only 6 rounds and dwindling ammunition across the Marine positions, a coordinated assault would overwhelm them in minutes. She needed better angles. The third floor gave her good sight lines to the north and east, but the southern approach was partially blocked by a water tower on an adjacent building. If the enemy came from that direction, she would not see them until they were already at the school's entrance. There was only one position that covered all approaches. The rooftop. Holbrook would say no. The rooftop was completely exposed, visible from every enemy position in a 4-block radius. Any shooter up there would become the primary target for every rifle in the area. But any shooter up there could also cover every approach, engage every assault team by the time they desperately needed. Yuna checked her ammunition one more time. 6 rounds. Maybe enough to break an assault if every shot counted. Maybe enough to give the QRF time to arrive. Chun, she said quietly, I need you to tell Gunny that I am moving to the roof. Chun stared at her. The roof? That is suicide. You will be completely exposed. I know. Yuna gathered the rifle and the spare magazines Chun had brought earlier. But from up there I can see everything. Every approach, every assault team, every threat. She met Chen's eyes. Is the only way we survive the next hour. You could die up there. I could die down here too. At least up there my death means something. Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of fear and respect. I will tell Holbrook. She paused. Give them hell, Yuna. Yuna climbed the final stairwell to the roof access, pushed open the heavy door, and stepped into the blinding Iraqi sun. The rooftop was flat and bare, offering no cover except a small mechanical housing near the center. She could see the entire battlefield from here, every building, every street, every shadow where death might be hiding. And every enemy fighter in Ramadi could see her. She walked to the edge of the roof, lay prone behind the low retaining wall, and settled the rifle into her shoulder. Below, the assault was beginning, and Yuna Kwan had 6 bullets to stop it. The roof access door banged open behind her. Yuna spun, rifle rising, finger finding the trigger before her mind caught up with her instincts. Rinko stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darker stairwell, his own weapon held across his chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. What are you doing up here? She demanded. Rinko stepped onto the roof and let the door swing shut behind him. Holbrook sent me. Said if you were going to get yourself killed up here, someone should at least watch your back. His voice was flat, stripped of the contempt that had colored every word he had spoken to her since the convoy left Camp Ramadi. I do not need you to watch my back. No. Rinko moved to the retaining wall and crouched beside her, scanning the enemy positions with hard eyes. You probably do not, but I am here anyway. Yuna stared at him, trying to read the change she sensed beneath his words. The Rinko who had shoved her to the ground, who had called her nothing, who had tried to take credit for her kills, that man would never have climbed to an exposed rooftop to protect a supply clerk. Something had shifted. Why, she asked. Rinko was silent for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he did not want to speak. Below them, the enemy assault teams were finalizing their positions, preparing for the push that would come any minute. Tom was running out for answers, but Yuna found herself waiting anyway. His name was Danny, Rinko said finally. PFC Daniel O'Connell. He was my best friend. We went through boot camp together, deployed together, did everything together. He paused. He was going to marry a Korean girl when we got back. Show me pictures of her every day. Talked about the wedding, the house they were going to buy, the kids they were going to have. Yuna felt something cold settle in her stomach. She did not want to hear this. She did not want to understand the man who had made her feel worthless for 11 months. But she could not stop listening. We were on a patrol outside Fallujah, Rinko continued. Routine sweep, supposed to be low threat. But we ran into an ambush. Bad one. Danny took a round in the leg, went down in the open. I tried to get to him, but there was too much fire, too many insurgents. He bled out in 20 minutes because we ran out of ammunition. His voice cracked on the last word, and he stopped to collect himself. Yuna waited. The resupply convoy was late, he said quietly. Some supply clerk screwed up the manifest, sent the wrong ammunition to the wrong unit. We had crates of rounds we could not use and nothing for the weapons we actually carried. Danny died because some POG who had never seen combat could not do basic paperwork. Yuna understood now. The contempt, the cruelty, the way he had looked at her like she was responsible for every failure of every support unit in the entire military. She was not the enemy. She was just the closest target for a grief that had nowhere else to go. I am sorry about your friend, she said. Rinko shook his head. Do not apologize. I have been blaming people like you for 2 years because it was easier than blaming myself. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were wet. I was 20 meters away when he got hit. 20 meters. I could have reached him if I had moved faster. I could have carried him to cover if I had been braver. But I froze. I froze and he died, and I have been taking it out on every support troop I have met since. The confession hung between them, raw and terrible and human. Yuna saw Rinko clearly for the first time, not as an antagonist or a bully, but as a broken man carrying a weight he did not know how to set down. Danny's death was not your fault, she said, and it was not the fault of some clerk who made a mistake on a manifest. It was the fault of the men who ambushed your patrol. The enemy killed your friend. Not you. Not supply. Rinko wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I know that. I have always known that. But knowing something and feeling something are different things. Yes. Yuna thought of her father, of the 3 years of silence between them, of the anger she had carried across an ocean. Movement caught her eye. The assault teams were advancing, fighters pouring out of the buildings to the east, spreading across the street in a coordinated rush. The moment of human connection shattered against the reality of combat. They are coming, she said, settling back into her shooting position. Rinko moved beside her, pulling binoculars from his vest. I will spot for you. Call your targets. Yuna felt something ease in her chest, some tension she had been carrying since the convoy first came under fire. She was not alone on this rooftop. She was not invisible anymore. For better or worse, Rinko was with her now, and together they would face whatever came next. The first wave of fighters reached the halfway point between the buildings and the school. 15 men, maybe more, moving fast and firing as they came. Behind them, a second wave was already forming up. 200 meters, Rinko called. Lead fighter, center mass. Yuna found the target, exhaled, and fired. The man dropped. 5 rounds remaining. 180 meters. Fighter on the left flank. He is carrying an RPG. She shifted, acquired, fired. The RPG carrier went down, and the launcher skidded across the pavement. 4 rounds. The assault wavered as fighters saw their comrades fall, but their leaders screamed at them to keep moving, and they pushed forward. 150 meters now. 130. The Marines on the lower floors were engaging, their rifles adding to the chaos, but the enemy had numbers and momentum. 100 meters, Rinko said, his voice tight. They're getting close. Yuna fired again. 3 rounds. Another fighter fell, but 2 more took his place. The math was impossible. 6 bullets to stop an army. It had always been impossible, but impossible was just the untrained word for difficult. Her father's voice filled her mind, steady and calm, guiding her as it had guided her entire life. She stopped thinking about ammunition counts and enemy numbers and the probability of survival. She stopped thinking entirely and let her training take over. The rifle became an extension of her body. The enemy became targets on a range. The chaos became stillness. And Yuna began to do what her father had spent 15 years teaching her to do. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. Yuna moved through targets like water flowing downhill, each shot following the last with mechanical precision. Her father had called it the stillness, that place beyond thought where the body remembered what the mind could not process fast enough. She had found it on his range 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with lives hanging on every trigger pull. 80 meters, Rinko called. 2 fighters behind the burned car. 1 is reloading. She fired. The reloading fighter dropped. 2 rounds remaining. The assault was fragmenting. Enemy fighters who had charged forward with confidence were now diving for cover, their momentum broken by the precise fire raining down from the rooftop. The Marines below had found their rhythm, pouring rounds into the gaps Yuna created, turning her surgical strikes into a wall of suppression. 70 meters. RPG, east side, he is setting up. Yuna swung the rifle, found the target, and fired in one fluid motion. The RPG carrier collapsed before he could shoulder the launcher. 1 round remaining. 1 round. 1 bullet between survival and annihilation. She felt the weight of it like a stone in her chest. The enemy knew it too. She could see them regrouping behind cover, could see the hand signals passing between squad leaders as they coordinated their next push. They had taken losses, bad ones, but they still had numbers. They still had ammunition. They still had time. The Marines did not. Rinko lowered his binoculars, his face grim. They're pulling back to regroup. We have maybe 3 minutes before they come again. How many left? He scanned the buildings, counting. At least 20. Maybe more in reserve. 20 fighters. 1 bullet. 3 minutes. Yuna's mind raced through possibilities. She could hold her last round for a critical target, save it for the moment when it would matter most. Or she could fire it now, try to take out another leader before they reorganized. Each choice led to the same destination. Eventually, she would have nothing left but an empty rifle and whatever the enemy decided to do with her. Below, she heard Holbrook shouting orders, redistributing ammunition, trying to shore up positions that were already crumbling. The school had become a fortress, but fortresses fell when the defenders ran out of ways to fight back. Yuna, Rinko said quietly. She looked at him. For what it is worth, he said, I'm glad you were on this convoy. Whatever happens next, you gave us a chance. You gave us more than a chance. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The words meant more than she could express, coming from the man who had spent 11 months making her feel worthless. Something had healed between them on this rooftop, something that would matter if they survived and would still matter if they did not. Movement. Eastern buildings. She snapped back to her scope. Fighters were emerging from cover, not charging this time, but advancing in coordinated bounds, one group moving while another provided covering fire. Professional tactics. Someone with training had taken command. And then she saw them. 2 men, moving together through an alley 60 meters to the southeast. One carried a heavy satchel that could only be explosives. The other held a detonator in his raised hand, ready to trigger the moment they reached the school's foundation. Suicide bomber. They were going to bring down the entire building. Rinko saw them at the same moment. Oh God, if they reached the wall, they would not need to breach the doors. They would not need to fight through the Marines. One explosion at the base of the old concrete structure would collapse it like a house of cards, killing everyone inside. 2 targets. 1 bullet. Yuna calculated angles, distances, trajectories. The men were moving in single file through the narrow alley, the bomber slightly ahead of the triggerman. If she shot the bomber, the triggerman would detonate. If she shot the triggerman, the bomber would reach the wall and someone else would set off the charge. There was no clean solution. There was no right answer. Unless her father's voice echoed in her memory. A lesson from when she was 15, shooting steel targets at extreme range. Sometimes the bullet is not the weapon, little one. Sometimes the bullet is just the beginning. The alley wall. Concrete block, old and weathered, at exactly the right angle. If she hit the corner at the precise spot, the bullet would fragment and ricochet. The concrete would become shrapnel. One shot could become many. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only option she had. 50 meters, Rinko breathed. They're almost at the corner. Yuna adjusted her aim. Not at the men. At the wall beside them. At the exact point where physics and geometry and desperate hope might combine into something like a miracle. 40 meters. She exhaled, found the stillness, felt her heartbeat slow to a crawl. 30 meters. Her finger touched the trigger. 20 meters. She fired. The bullet hit the corner of the alley wall at 1,700 feet per second. The old concrete exploded outward in a spray of fragments, turning a single round into a dozen lethal projectiles. The bomber caught shrapnel across his face and chest and went down screaming. The triggerman took fragments in his throat and dropped the detonator as his hands flew to the wound. Both men fell. Neither explosion came. Rinko stared at her with an expression of pure disbelief. How? How did you? Yuna lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking now, the stillness broken by the impossibility of what she had just done. I do not know, she said honestly. I do not know. From the west, a sound rose above the gunfire. The heavy thump of helicopter rotors, growing louder, growing closer. Rinko grabbed her shoulder and pointed. QRF. That is our QRF. The cavalry was coming. Against all odds, against every calculation that said they should already be dead, the Marines had held long enough. But the battle was not over. Through her scope, Yuna saw one more fighter break from cover and sprint toward the school. He was young, barely more than a boy, and he carried something in his hands that glinted in the Iraqi sun. A grenade. He was 30 meters from the main entrance and closing fast. Yuna reached for her rifle before remembering. The magazine was empty. She had no more bullets, and the boy with the grenade was still running. The grenade runner was 15 meters from the entrance when Hastings stepped through the doorway. Yuna watched it happen in slow motion, helpless, her empty rifle useless in her hands. The young Marine planted his feet, raised his weapon, and fired 3 rounds in quick succession. The runner stumbled, staggered, and fell face first onto the pavement. The grenade rolled from his limp fingers and came to rest against a pile of rubble, its pin still intact. Hastings stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the body. Then he looked up at the rooftop where Yuna lay prone behind the retaining wall. He raised one hand in a gesture that was part salute and part wave. Figured you might need some backup, he called up. Superhero sniper cannot do everything herself. Yuna let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her body felt hollow, emptied of everything except exhaustion and relief. Beside her, Rinko was laughing, the sound raw and slightly hysterical, the release of tension that had been building for hours. The helicopters were visible now, 3 Black Hawks sweeping in from the west with door gunners already scanning for targets. The remaining insurgents saw them coming and began to scatter, melting back into the buildings and alleys, choosing survival over continued assault. Within minutes, the streets that had been a killing ground fell silent. It was over. Yuna pushed herself up from the rooftop, her arms trembling with the effort. The rifle hung heavy from its sling, empty and useless, but she could not bring herself to set it down. It had become part of her over the last few hours, an extension of her will, and releasing it felt like releasing a piece of herself. Rinko rose beside her, dusting debris from his uniform. The hostility that had defined him for 11 months was gone, replaced by something she could not quite name. Respect, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that they had survived something together that neither of them would ever forget. Come on, he said. Let us get off this roof before somebody decides to take one last shot. They descended through the shattered school, passing Marines who looked up as they went by. Yuna saw the change in their eyes, the way they tracked her movement, the way they nodded or murmured words she could not quite hear. She had been invisible to these men for 11 months. Now they saw her, truly saw her, and what they saw had earned something that rank and position could never provide. Holbrook met them at the ground floor entrance. He looked exhausted, his uniform dark with sweat and dust, but his eyes were sharp as they found Yuna. The QRF commander is on the radio, he said. He wants to know who is doing the shooting from the rooftop. Apparently his spotters counted at least 15 confirmed kills from that position alone. Yuna said nothing. The number felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of what she had done. 15 lives ended by her hand. 15 men who would never go home, never see their families, never grow old. She had not let herself think about it during the battle, but now the weight of it began to settle on her shoulders. Holbrook seemed to understand. He put a hand on her arm, brief and firm. You saved Marines today, Private. Whatever else you are feeling, hold on to that. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Outside, the scene was chaos in the aftermath of violence. QRF Marines were spreading through the area, securing buildings and collecting weapons from fallen insurgents. Medevac helicopters were landing in the street, corpsmen rushing to treat the wounded. The burned hulks of the convoy vehicles still smoldered in the distance, markers of where the day had begun. Yuna stepped into the sunlight and felt the heat wash over her like a wave. Her legs were unsteady, her hands still trembling, but she was alive. They were all alive, or at least more of them than should have been possible given the odds they had faced. Marines began to gather around her. Hastings was first, his bandaged forehead giving him a rakish look, grinning like he had just won the lottery. Then Chun, quiet and steady, offering a canteen without words. Then others, men she had never spoken to, men who had ignored her for 11 months, now looking at her with expressions that ranged from wonder to gratitude. The radio chatter spread the story faster than any of them could walk. A supply clerk, the voices said. A supply clerk picked up a sniper rifle and held off an entire insurgent assault. 15 confirmed kills, maybe more. Shots at 800 meters in combat conditions. The girl who drove trucks just saved an entire convoy. Yuna heard fragments of it, carried on the wind, passed between Marines who pointed in her direction and shook their heads in disbelief. She wanted to tell them it was not like that she was not some hero from a movie, that she had been terrified every second and had simply done what her father had trained her to do. But the words would not come. Webb was being loaded onto a stretcher nearby. He caught her eye and raised his good hand, giving her a thumbs up that said more than any words could express. She returned the gesture, feeling the sting of tears she refused to let fall. Sergeant Odia approached, her face streaked with grime and blood that was not her own. I owe you my life, she said simply. We all do. I do not know where you learned to shoot like that, but thank God you were here today. Yuna accepted the words with a nod. She was learning that there was nothing she could say that would feel adequate, no response that would match the weight of what had happened. So she simply stood among the Marines who had become her brothers and sisters in the space of a few hours and let their gratitude wash over her like rain. The QRF commander found Holbrook, and the two men spoke in low tones, glancing occasionally in Yuna's direction. She could guess what they were discussing. Reports to file. Commendations to recommend. Questions about how a motor transport supply clerk had acquired the skills of an elite sniper. She would answer those questions eventually. She would tell them about her father, about the years of training, about the choice she had made to hide who she was. But not now. Now she just wanted to breathe, to feel the sun on her face, to appreciate the simple miracle of being alive. The crowd around her parted, and Yuna looked up to see Rinko walking toward her. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. The other Marines fell silent, watching, sensing that something important was about to happen. Rinko stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the dust in the lines of his face, the redness around his eyes, the weight of everything he had carried for 2 years pressing down on his shoulders. He did not speak. He just stood there, looking at her, and Yuna waited for whatever was coming next. Rinko reached up and removed his helmet. It was a gesture Yuna had seen 1,000 times, Marines taking off their helmets after a mission, after a patrol, after the danger had passed. But Rinko did it slowly, deliberately, like he was removing something more than Kevlar and padding, like he was removing a weight he had carried for 2 years. I was wrong about you, he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by hours of shouting over gunfire. I was wrong about everything. Yuna waited. She could feel the other Marines watching, could sense the importance of this moment rippling through the gathered crowd. Whatever happened next would define something, would close a chapter or open a new one, and everyone present seemed to understand that. Rinko took a breath. Danny would have liked you, he said quietly. he would have seen what I was too blind to see. That the uniform does not make the warrior. The heart does. He paused. You have more heart than anyone I have ever served with. The words hit her harder than she expected. Not because they were praise, but because they were true. Rinko was not flattering her or performing for the audience. He was simply stating what he had learned on that rooftop, what the battle had beaten into him, what he could no longer deny. I am sorry, he continued, for how I treated you, for what I said, for the 11 months I spent making you feel like you did not belong here. He shook his head. You belonged here more than any of us. We just cannot see it. Yuna found her voice. You were carrying something heavy, she said. Grief makes us blind sometimes. That is not an excuse. No, but it is an explanation. And explanations matter. Rinko nodded slowly. Then he did something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened that day. He extended his hand. Not a salute, not a formal gesture, but a simple offer of respect between equals. Yuna took it. His grip was firm and warm and real. And when he released her hand, she felt something shift between them. The antagonist who had made her invisible for 11 months was gone. In his place stood a man who had faced his demons and found the courage to acknowledge them. The crowd began to disperse, Marines returning to the work of securing the area and treating the wounded. But Holbrook remained, watching the exchange with eyes that missed nothing. Private Kwan, he said when Rinko had stepped away. Walk with me. They moved through the chaos of the aftermath, past medics working on wounded Marines, past QRF soldiers stacking captured weapons, past the burned vehicles that had started it all. Holbrook did not speak until they reached a relatively quiet corner near the school's entrance. I'm putting you in for Bronze Star, he said. Maybe Silver. What you did today goes beyond anything I've seen in 3 combat deployments. Yuna shook her head. I was just doing my job, Gunnery Sergeant. Your job is supply requisitions and convoy logistics. Holbrook's expression softened slightly. What you did today was something else entirely, and the Corps needs to know about it. She did not know how to respond. Awards and commendations had never mattered to her. They had mattered to her father, to her grandfather, to 4 generations of Kwans who had measured their worth in medals and citations. But she had joined the Marines to escape all that, to find her own path, to be more than her family's legacy. Except today, she had become exactly what her family had always produced. A warrior, a protector, someone who stood between the innocent and the darkness and refused to move. There's going to be attention, Holbrook continued. Questions from command, maybe from the press. Your story is going to get out, one way or another. He paused. Is there anyone you want to notify before that happens? Family who should hear it from you first? Her father's face flashed through her mind. 3 years of silence, of stubborn pride on both sides, of words unspoken and bridges unrepaired. He would hear about this eventually. The Korean military community was small and connected, and news of a Korean-American woman holding off an insurgent assault with a sniper rifle would spread like wildfire. She should call him. She knew she should call him. But the thought of hearing his voice, of facing whatever he would say, made her chest tight with emotions she could not name. I will think about it, she said. Holbrook nodded and left her alone with her thoughts. Yuna found a quiet spot near the school's rear entrance, away from the bustle of the aftermath. She sat on a pile of rubble and pulled the photograph from her breast pocket. It was creased and worn, the edges soft from months of handling. Her father stared back at her, younger in the image, wearing the dress uniform of the ROK Army with rows of ribbons on his chest. She had taken the photo without his knowledge the day before she left for America. A piece of home to carry with her, even as she ran away from everything home represented. I understand now, she said quietly to the image. I understand why you pushed so hard, why you wanted so much for me. She traced the outline of his face with her finger. You were trying to prepare me for days like this, for moments when the training would be the only thing between life and death. The photograph did not answer. It never did. But for the first time in 3 years, Yuna felt like she could hear her father's voice anyway, steady and calm, telling her what he had told her 1,000 times before. One shot, one purpose. Your purpose is not the bullet. Your purpose is what the bullet protects. She had protected Marines today. She had honored her training, her family, her legacy. She had become what her father had always known she could be. Now, she just had to find the courage to tell him. Footsteps approached, and Yuna looked up to see Chun walking toward her. The Lance Corporal's face was serious, her eyes holding something Yuna could not read. "I have been looking for you," Chun said. She held out a satellite phone. "Your father called the Battalion Operations Center 3 times in the last 2 hours. He saw the news reports coming out of Ramadi. He knows you were in that convoy." Yuna stared at the phone like it was a live grenade. "He left a message," Chun continued softly. "He said he needs to hear your voice. He said he needs to know you are alive." The phone felt impossibly heavy in Yuna's hand. 3 years of silence. 3 years of stubborn pride and unspoken words. And now her father was reaching across the ocean, across the distance she had created, because he had seen the news and feared the worst. Chun squeezed her shoulder and walked away, leaving Yuna alone with the phone and the photograph and the choice she had been avoiding for 3 years. Her father's number was still saved in the phone's memory. She had never deleted it, even when she told herself she never wanted to speak to him again. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like a year, stretching the silence between heartbeats into something vast and terrifying. Yuna almost ended the call, almost let the cowardice win, almost chose another 3 years of silence over the vulnerability of this moment. Then her father answered. "Yuna." His voice cracked on her name, and in that single word she heard everything he had never been able to say. Fear, relief, love, pride. All the emotions he had buried beneath decades of military discipline, finally breaking through. Appa, the Korean word for father, came automatically, the language of her childhood rising up from somewhere deep. "I am here. I am alive." The sound he made was not quite a sob, but it was close. She had never heard her father cry, not when her mother died, not when he retired from a service that had defined his entire life, not once in 23 years. But now, across an ocean and a war zone, she could hear the tears in his voice. "I saw the reports," he said in Korean. "They said a convoy was ambushed in Ramadi. They said there were casualties. They did not release names, but I knew. I knew you were there. I felt it." Yuna closed her eyes. The photograph was still in her other hand, her father's younger face staring up at her. "How did you know?" "Because you're my daughter." His voice steadied slightly, finding the familiar cadence of the instructor, the master sergeant, the man who had shaped warriors for 2 decades. "Because I trained you. Because I know what you are capable of, even if you spent 3 years pretending otherwise." She wanted to argue. She wanted to defend her choices, her independence, her right to find her own path. But the words would not come. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I used what you taught me," she said instead. "Everything you taught me. It saved lives today, Appa. It saved my life." The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of absence and the weight of words never spoken. "I was wrong," her father said finally. The admission came slowly, like he was pulling each word from somewhere deep. "I pushed too hard. I wanted too much. I tried to make you into what I thought you should be instead of letting you become who you were meant to be." Yuna felt tears sliding down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dust and grime. "You were trying to prepare me. I understand that now. I did not understand it then, but I do now. You were always stubborn." There was a hint of warmth in his voice now, something almost like humor. "Even as a child, you would practice a shot 100 times until you got it perfect, but only if you decided it was worth practicing. If I told you to do it, you would resist. If you chose to do it yourself, nothing could stop you." She laughed despite the tears. "That sounds about right. Today you chose," he said. "Today you picked up a rifle, and you chose to be what I always knew you could be. Not because I wanted it, because the moment demanded it, because people needed you. Yes, that is all I ever wanted for you, Yuna. Not medals, not glory, not the continuation of some family legacy. I wanted you to be ready when the moment came. I wanted you to be able to protect the people who mattered." His voice broke again. "And today you did." She could not speak. The emotions were too big, too raw, too real. 3 years of anger and resentment and stubborn pride, dissolving in the face of a father's love that had never wavered, even when she had pushed him away. "Come home," he said softly, "when your deployment is finished. Come home and let me see you. Let me tell you in person what I should have told you 3 years ago." "What is that?" "That I am proud of you. That I have always been proud of you. That the day you were born was the best day of my life. And every day since then has been a gift, even the days when you hated me." "I never hated you, Appa." "I know, but I gave you reasons to. And I'm sorry for that." The satellite phone's battery indicator blinked a warning. Their time was running short, but Yuna felt like they had said more in these few minutes than they had in years of living under the same roof. "I have to go," she said, "but I will call again. Soon. I promise. I will be waiting. Every day until you come home." She ended the call and sat for a long moment with the phone pressed against her chest. The tears were still falling, but they felt different now. Not tears of grief or anger or exhaustion. Tears of release. Tears of healing. Tears at a bridge being rebuilt across 3 years of silence. 2 weeks later, Yuna stood in the briefing room at Camp Ramadi, waiting for the morning convoy assignment. The room was full of Marines, the same faces she had seen every day for 11 months, but everything was different now. They nodded to her when she entered. They made space for her at the front of the room. They looked at her not as the invisible supply clerk, but as something else entirely. The story had spread far beyond the battalion. The quiet girl with the sniper rifle. The supply clerk who held off an army. 15 confirmed kills and an impossible shot that had become legend before the dust even settled. Command had flown in officers from division headquarters to interview her. Reporters had requested access that was firmly denied. Her name was being mentioned in conversations that reached all the way to the Pentagon. But none of that mattered as much as what happened next. Gunnery Sergeant Holbrook entered the room and called the briefing to order. He ran through the standard information, convoy routes, and threat assessments and logistics details. Then he paused and looked directly at Yuna. "Private First Class Quan," he said, a moment after the briefing. The other Marines filed out, many of them clapping her on the shoulder or offering words of encouragement as they passed. Rinko was last, and he gave her a nod that carried more meaning than any words could express. Then the room was empty except for her and Holbrook. "I have been in contact with the battalion commander," Holbrook said, "and with some people above him. There are opportunities opening up for you, Quan. Training pipelines, specialty schools, paths that do not usually open for motor transport Marines." Yuna nodded slowly. She had expected something like this. Holbrook studied her face. "The question is whether you want them. You could stay in supply, finish your enlistment, go home, and pretend none of this ever happened." He paused. "Or you could become what you were clearly born to be." She thought about her father, about the phone call, about the bridge they were slowly rebuilding. She thought about Webb on the stretcher, giving her a thumbs up. She thought about Rinko's apology, about Chin's steady presence, about Hastings calling her a superhero. She thought about the rifle in her hands and the stillness she had found on that rooftop. She thought about purpose. "What exactly are you offering, Gunnery Sergeant?" Holbrook allowed himself a small smile. "Scout Sniper School. If you want it. I have already made the recommendation." Yuna looked around the briefing room, at the maps and charts and schedules that had defined her invisible existence for 11 months. Then she looked at Holbrook, at the respect in his eyes, at the future he was offering. She thought about her father's words. Not medals, not glory, the ability to protect the people who matter. "When do I leave?" she asked. Holbrook's smile widened. "Soon, Private. Very soon." Yuna walked out of the briefing room and into the bright Iraqi sun. The war was still raging around her, the dangers still present, the uncertainty still real. But for the first time since she had arrived in this country, she knew exactly who she was and exactly where she belonged. The quiet girl had found her voice. The invisible woman had been seen. And the daughter of Master Sergeant Park, Quan, was finally ready to honor the legacy she had spent 3 years running from. Not because her father wanted it, because she chose it. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what moment hit you hardest, or share about someone you know whose hidden strength changed everything when it mattered most.